folks. So first of all, I would like to apologise for the hiatus. I've been away for a few months and I'm only now getting the time to start up this video series again. My schedule is a little bit more fixed now, so I hope to get the next few videos out fairly soon. Secondly, I am still away just now, so I unfortunately don't have my home setup, so the sound quality might be a little bit worse than usual. Please let me know if this is a serious issue. If so, I will try and get a better mic to record with until I get back home. In this video, we'll finally get to the first part of actually writing our story. The initial quest that our hero will embark upon and the conversation that leads up to it. Good, compelling writing in RPGs is really the thing that makes them stand out for me more than anything else. I assume we've all played our fair share of RPGs with fantastic graphics and well-crafted combat mechanics, but we would quickly grow bored of them despite the fact that these qualities were there on the surface. At the same time, old RPGs that amount to little more than a few 2D sprites and text boxes continue to enjoy immense popularity from generation after generation of players. What is the difference here? The most likely thing is the quality of the writing. Like in any form of storytelling, be it a book, a TV series or a film, writing in a video game needs to draw in our audience and keep them engaged throughout the narrative. This is a difficult task for multiple reasons. First, we need to think about the various facets of writing: the setting, the plot, the supporting characters, themes, pacing, and many other things. Secondly, we need to understand that different types of players enjoy games in different ways. One player might enjoy playing a brutish, greedy bounty hunter, while another would rather play a selfless, nurturing cleric. This is where RPGs really get the chance to shine. A good RPG will be able to facilitate both of these playstyles and many others, but it needs to provide the options for doing just that. And nowhere is this level of complexity more apparent than in conversations our character is going to have with the world of the game. Let's keep this in mind as we actually get to writing the dialogue. Without further ado, let's dive back in. We can start by going to our merchant and right-clicking and heading over to Properties. At the bottom of the Basic tab, we will see the window marked Conversation, and it is currently blank. We can change that. Let's click the Edit button, and that will create a brand new conversation file for us. Conversations in the editor follow a tree structure. We start out with the root node, then branch out based on the player's choices along the way. As mentioned, we want the conversations to be interactive and exciting for various types of players, so the ideal branching dialogue will have multiple choices with various consequences. Keep in mind, it is easy to lose control of your branches and make your conversation too sprawling and unmanageable. There are various ways to avoid this pitfall and keep our conversations tidy while still providing a degree of choice to the player. In this simple example, we're going to add several choke points. A choke point is a point in the conversation where some or all of the branches converge. The player can freely explore the first part of the conversation, asking questions in any order they like, but they will have to pass a certain point in the conversation in order to actually receive the quest. From the choke point, we can branch out again, and this will be the point where the player can actually affect the outcome of the story. Let's begin by making our first node. Right-click on the root and press Add. Then type in the first sentence that your NPC will say. Typically, this will be a call to action, something to draw our player in. It's really tempting and easy to front load our conversation with a bunch of exposition, explaining the situation in great detail. Keep in mind, however, that this isn't how people talk in the real world, especially if you're in distress. So here, our merchant will ask for the player's help straight away, then provide any additional information to the player if they require it. You'll see the new sentence come up here with the owner tag. This is the owner of the conversation file, that is our merchant NPC. From here on, the conversation will follow round-robin convention. First, the owner will speak, then our player will get a chance to respond, then back to the owner, and so on. We can customize conversations for more characters and participants later on, and this is good for mini cutscenes, such as if the player witnesses an argument between two NPCs, for example. For now, this will be a simple dialogue between two people. Now, let's give the player some options. The rule of thumb I use is to give the player at least 2 choices after each piece of NPC text. Obviously, this isn't always viable, but generally you want at least 2, even if they ultimately lead to the same outcome, like in our case. So, what are the ways we can react to meeting a distressed person in the street asking for help? The 2 obvious ways our player can respond are with curiosity, what's going on, or with rebuttal, leave me alone. Of course, there are many more options to consider here as well. The player could, for example, be suspicious of the merchant. She could be leading our player into a trap. For now, let's just add the first 2 choices, and then you'll get a chance to expand the dialogue later if you wish. So let's add 2 nodes. Great. Now let's have the NPC explain the situation if the player asks what's going on. We'll come back to the other response in a moment. If you played a lot of RPGs, you'll know that players don't generally like reading big, massive walls of text. Even if you're really involved in the lore, you'll probably skim most of the conversations, if not outright skip to the bit where you get the quest and jump into the action. This doesn't mean that our writing can be sloppy, but it does mean that we want to be concise. Keep your exposition short, summarize the NPC's desires in a few sentences, and then your players won't have to slog through walls of text just to understand what they need to do. So let's have a wee pause and think about which points we need to convey. First of all, the merchant was ambushed by goblins. Second, they stole her cargo. Third, they carried it off to their camp. Fourth, she isn't able to retrieve it herself. And fifth, she will give the player a reward for retrieving it. So let's write a bit of dialogue for this. The bulk of your dialogue should deal with these 5 points. However, I'm also going to add a few flourishes of contextual information to make our conversation seem more natural. You can decide on your own phrasing here. Look to your favourite RPGs for inspiration on how to properly balance depth and brevity. Something important to note here, most modern RPGs will typically be fully voice acted. This costs a lot of money, so points need to be conveyed quickly and deliberately so as not to waste too much cash elaborating on seemingly useless information. Thankfully, in Aurora, we don't have the voice acting restriction. Our dialogue can read much more naturally because we are not constrained by voice acting budget. There's no need to make every conversation overly elaborate, of course, but I would urge you to compare the style of dialogue between older, non-voiced RPGs and modern RPGs and see if you can spot the difference in how the dialogue is written. Think about which style is more immersive to you. Okay, now that's done, so let's take a look at the player's other option, which is leave me alone. Normally, a quest like this would be a secondary quest in the game, a non-critical, take it or leave it sort of quest. A good number of players will probably simply not bother doing it at all, and it's good to provide that option. Normally, this would be an exit strategy from the quest dialogue. However, since this is our only quest for now, the player doesn't get that option. We'll have the NPC try to appeal to the good nature of our player, and the player will be slightly railroaded into at least hearing the NPC out. So let's add something here. Now, if you've noticed, both of these outcomes point to the same direction. There's no need to rewrite our exposition from the above answer. The conversation editor very cleverly allows us to jump to the node we've already written. We can just copy and then choose paste as link. The grayed out text here means that the NPC will jump to that node in the conversation, creating our first choke point. Basically, regardless of which conversation option the player chooses, they will still end up at the exposition, but they will have the illusion of choice, which will make the scene feel very different from just sitting through a cutscene. Now, let's tailor the rest of the conversation to different types of players. So, I've identified 3 different types. You might think of more, but let's go with these 3 for now. Obviously, you can tailor this as you see fit to your own world. So, my first type is the no-nonsense adventurer. Your first lot will just want to get on with it. Let's give them that option by simply accepting the quest without asking for any more information. We can do this with a basic I accept the quest option, obviously phrased in a slightly nicer way, and an acknowledgement from the NPC. So let's do that now. After the NPC speaks, let's add a blank note in response. This automatically creates an end dialogue option and officially closes out the conversation for the player. Nice and easy. So the second type is the mercenary. Now, the mercenary will want more information. After all, not everyone is willing to risk their life for a crate of iron ingots or whatever else your merchant was carrying. So let's give them the option of inquiring about the reward. We'll come back to this one in a moment. Now, the third type that I'm looking at is the action hero. And the action hero is going to be a good character. We're going to assume that most people that play these RPGs tend to play characters that are some sort of good on the alignment system, or at least neutral. So the action hero is your classic sort of lawful good heroing type. They don't need the reward when there's glory and reputation to be had. I'm going to explain this quickly by digressing to talk about the D&D alignment system. Now, if you are already familiar with this and understand it, you can kind of skip 2 minutes ahead. I'm just going to discuss it quickly in case people aren't familiar. So an alignment can be defined as the character's overall nature. Are they good, evil, or morally ambiguous? Do they follow the law and keep a strict personal moral code? Or are they more of a happy-go-lucky, charming outlaw type? So D&D traditionally measures these personality traits on a 2-axis system. The vertical axis is good versus evil. This one is pretty self-explanatory. Good characters are selfless, helpful, virtuous, pious, while evil characters tend to be selfish, unhelpful, untrustworthy, kind of like a bad Disney villain. The horizontal axis is lawful versus chaotic, and this is slightly harder to pinpoint, but it's generally understood as follows. So our lawful characters follow a strict set of rules, the laws of the land, even if they're unjust, or some other tradition. Chaotic characters disregard tradition, embrace progress, and play by their own rules. Characters' position on one axis does not influence their position on the other, but for classic character tropes, they often correlate. So, for example, paladins before 5th edition, they changed this in 5th edition, but in 3.5 and before, had to be lawful good. They're both good-natured and selfless, and also devoted to the laws of the land and their deity. Most monsters, on the other hand, including our goblins, were by contrast chaotic evil. So their society had few rules, and they are generally selfish and unpleasant creatures. However, we can produce more interesting combinations. In the classic example, Robin Hood, the great folk hero who stole from the rich and gave to the poor, is often considered chaotic good. His intentions are good and generous, but he is an outlaw that fights against the unjust society that he lives in. His arch rival, the Sheriff of Nottingham, by contrast, can be considered lawful evil. He is selfish and greedy, but acts within the parameters of the established law of the land when he extorts money from the peasants. So, what does all of this have to do with our conversation? Well, firstly, it's a way to distinguish player types. Players in a role-playing game will typically want to play in accordance with their alignment. It is always good to recognize those players by giving them additional options. These don't have to be major, but they can be. For example, in the opening scene of my own campaign, players are given the chance to recruit a potential companion who's a drunken dwarf that ended up in a local jail. However, lawful evil players specifically have the additional option of executing the dwarf for his crimes, losing the potential to recruit him, but gaining some XP in the process. We can also use this system to punish players for going against their alignment. Remember when I said paladins had to be lawful good? In 3rd edition, which Neverwinter Nights is based on, this isn't just a bit of throwaway lore. A character with the paladin class who, for some reason, stops being lawful good, can no longer gain levels as a paladin and loses access to some of their abilities until they redeem themselves. So we can actually use the alignment system as both a carrot and a stick to reinforce players acting in character, or else face consequences. This is of course entirely optional. If you don't feel the need to punish or reward players for certain choices, that is also absolutely fine. Just keep in mind that this is a tool that is available to you. So, returning back to our 3rd conversation option, let's do this now. The option will be available to all players, regardless of alignment, but if chosen, will shift their alignment 2 points towards good. They're forfeiting a reward, but instead they're getting a happy, fuzzy feeling inside that comes out with helping a person in need. My convention for these is as follows. If this is an alignment shift, like what we're doing, I will preface it with round brackets with the direction of the shift. Here I'll say round brackets good before the response. If this is an option only available to players of a specific alignment, I would do the same but with square brackets. This helps me tell exclusive choices apart from alignment changes, but you are welcome to try out your own convention if you find this unhelpful. Given that we are accepting the quest here as well, we can simply link our first response from the NPC. This is going to be our 2nd choke point. The player will go through this interaction regardless, but again, it appears that they have a multitude of choices and approaches. Now, let's return to option 2. Here, we want to utilize another cool ability of the Aurora toolset, a skill check. Skills, if you're not aware, are a secondary statistic that most RPGs have. While your attributes are general traits of your character, your strength, intellect, charisma, skills are particular talents and abilities that each character has. In D&D, all skills depend on a parent attribute. For example, the skill Persuasion, which we're going to use here, depends on the character's charisma attribute. So first of all, let's have the NPC set the default reward at 50 gold. Now, we're not going to program this in just now, but I will come back and explain how we're going to do this. 50 gold is not bad, but our character might want a little bit more. Obviously, we want to give them another exit ramp here and just accept the 50 gold as given, or they can try and push their luck for a higher reward. It does help us to think about the nature of our NPC when writing out these situations. Here, the player obviously has the upper hand. The merchant can't get the cargo herself, as she has already explicitly stated. That means that any attempt by the player to haggle will be met with little resistance. The merchant doesn't have much choice. In other situations, we can make this interaction riskier. For example, if the player is instead talking to a wealthy and powerful gang boss, a failed persuasion attempt might actually cause the gang boss to pay the player less than the original value. You can imagine her saying something like, "Oh yeah, you think you're all that? Well, you're going to do it for 40 gold now." Unfortunately, our merchant does not have an army of gangsters, so she will automatically acquiesce to a request for a raise. The check will simply determine how much of a bonus the greedy player will receive in the situation. So let's insert a line where the player proposes 75. We can preface this with highlight, skill check, persuasion, and then create the two options. Optional conversation in Aurora works in a similar way to an if statement, if you remember the last video, and in fact it uses a script to determine which part of the conversation plays out. So the order is important here. The first response where the condition is met will be played. I will explain this later on. We will see how this works. So we will need to put the success option first, and this is where our conditional will go. If the player is successful on their check, then the conditional is true, and that bit of conversation gets played. If the player is unsuccessful, then the conditional is false, and we skip to the next available bit of conversation. You can make these conditionals more complex, but always keep in mind the order. The first successful condition in the list is always played. In my own project, I like to go for the success, partial success, failure model for skill checks. For full success, the player needs to pass a roll of that skill at a relatively high value. For example, above 15 or DC 15 in D&D terms. If they pass that, they get the full success with all the benefits. If they fail that, they can roll again against a lower difficulty, let's say DC 10. If they pass this one, they get some but not all of the benefits of a full success. Only if they fail both checks do they get the failure message and no benefits at all, or maybe even a drawback. Here, however, we're going to keep things simple with a basic success or failure. So let's write out those options. The success option is going to come first and should amount to the merchant being persuaded. Let's write dialogue to that effect. Remember, mundane persuasion isn't a magic wand that makes the NPC love our player and agree with them straight away. The NPC here might even be resentful of the player for this act of extortion, but realizes that it's still a better choice than losing everything. So the tone of the reply should be resigned and accepting rather than joyful. Once we've done that, we can insert the failure option. The tone here is similar. The player has tried to extort our NPC, but not successfully enough, so she will be a little bit more assertive in declining. Still, she's in a position of weakness right now, so she will bargain with the player to try and meet in the middle. Now we will need to decide which of the dialogue options is played. If we leave it as is, the top option, success, will always be played in the conversation, and the failure will never be triggered. So we need to specify a condition on the success statement to see if we play it or skip it. If you watched the last video about scripting, you will recognize this as being similar to our conditional if statement within the Oxus script. Like much of the other logic, these branching conversation options are controlled via script. However, the conversation editor provides us with a really easy way of creating that controlling script using the script wizard. Of course, if you would like to fine-tune the logic or write your own, you have the option to do that. The thing to remember here is that the script on the text appears when tab, whether custom or created using the wizard, will need to return a Boolean value that is true or false. If that Boolean is true, then the particular option is going to be played. If it's false, we're going to skip it and move to the next available option and try and do the same there. So here we're just going to use the script wizard to set up our conditional. If you remember, the success tag here refers to a successful skill check in persuasion. So let's add that now. In the script wizard, we want to select the skill check. You can test for many other conditions. As you can see, this does open up some nice options. For example, a dwarf NPC might have unique conversation lines when speaking to a dwarf player character. But we're not going to bother with that for now. For now, let's just make a simple skill check and click next. Here we want to set the difficulty and the skill itself. Let's call it a normal level persuade check. The auto DC script will determine what normal means in this context, but it's tied to the owning NPC of the conversation and I think the player's level. A normal check against a level 20 dragon is much more challenging than a normal check against our level 1 merchant, for example. So let's click this add button to add this check and press next. Let's call the generated script something. Persuading NPCs seems like a thing we'll want to do quite often, so it's a good idea to save the script with a memorable name for later reuse. For skill checks, I tend to go with SKCH for skill check, underscore, then the shorthand name of the skill, underscore again, and then shorthand difficulty. So this one I will call SKCH underscore PER for persuasion, underscore med for normal or medium. You can decide on your own convention if you don't like this, but that's personally what I like to use. If you like, you can also take a look at the script to try and understand what's going on, but I'm not going to go through that just now. I will do another in-depth scripting video later on. So we have our success node with a text appears when option. Remember, again, this node will only appear if the script returns true, that is, if the player passes our skill check, otherwise it will go to the next available node. If there are many of these conditional nodes, it will keep going through them in sequential order until it finds one that is true. A node that does not have a condition attached is always considered true. So we are going to place our failure node below the success node, making this the default option if the first skill check fails. Remember, the merchant is in dire straits, so she will agree to a raise even in the case of failure. The size of that raise won't be much, but we're rewarding our player for attempting the interaction. So let's do that now. Whichever option the player hits here, the end result is again going to be the same. They will accept the quest from the quest giver. Again, let's use our linking function to get the player to link back to the acceptance node. This means that ultimately, whichever way the conversation goes, the player will always end up on this node. We will see why this is important in a sec. Obviously, we could go more in depth with them continuing to haggle over the price or the player choosing not to take the quest and so forth. You can add these options into your own conversations. For now, I think we've covered most of the basics. So the last thing that we want to do is to add the actual quest. So let's save our conversation and make sure it's as signed to the NPC. If you haven't given it a name, the typical convention I use is C underscore and then the name of the NPC. And I believe this is the same convention as is used by the original games as well. So if you created this conversation through the edit button of your NPC, it will automatically be assigned. If not, simply go to your NPC through the area overview and in the basic tab, select the correct conversation file. So now that that's saved, let's open up our journal editor. We can do this by going to Tools and then Journal Editor or using the shortcut Ctrl-Alt-J. The journal editor looks similar to the conversation editor, except here we have only a root node and 2 levels of branches below. To add our first quest, let's click this little add button here and we can use that to create a new category node for our quest. The category node is essentially the general information for the quest, so let's add some parameters here. Select the node and then edit the required information in the context box below. So first we're going to need a name for our quest. I like to keep them short and sweet, but you can perhaps think of a cleverer name for this particular quest, maybe a pun or some sort of inside joke, I don't know. For me, I'm just going to call this Goblin Trouble and give the quest the tag Q underscore Goblin Trouble. Again, it's good to decide on a particular convention if you're going to use for various pieces you're editing, and that will just make it super easy to find later on, and you're not having to go about and think, what did I call this conversation or what did I call this quest? They're all neatly sorted for you. So we can leave the priority and XP values for now as is. We will be coming back to this quest to fix it up later on. For now, we are going to just add our first little bit of quest text, the stuff that will actually appear in the player's log once they accept the quest. So we can type in some fancy quest text here. This is a good chance to flex your creative muscles and come up with a colourful description of the situation. Remember though, same as with the conversation, we need to convey the necessary information. Our player isn't likely to get lost with just one quest in their log, but if they suddenly have 10, 20 or 30 quests, good descriptions can save us a lot of time. Once we're happy with the description, we can apply it and exit out of the journal editor. So now there is one last thing that we need to do before we're ready to test. We can return back to our conversation file. You can find this in the overview on the left. Just right click and select edit. Alternatively, you could go back to your NPC properties and select the edit button on the conversation there. So let's find our original quest accept node. Now we do need to look for the original, not one of the copied links. We're not able to update those because they are just copies. So we need to find the one that we originally wrote. If we have done everything right, every conversation branch should eventually lead to this node. That means we really only have to add the journal entry in one place, and generally we like that. The less manual work we have to do, the better. So once we've located the node, let's select it and go to Other Actions. Once we're here, we can find our quest in the first drop-down under Journal and leave the ID at 1. Very simple. Now, as always, let's save and test the conversation. Now, hopefully, if we've done everything correctly, we can take any path through the conversation and still receive the notification for the quest. We'll get a notification in the chat box, and checking the journal log reveals our mighty quest in all of its glory. So I think we will conclude this here for now. There are still a couple of things to fix up in this conversation. We currently aren't doing the alignment shift on the good option, and we aren't saving the result of the players haggling anywhere, but we will address those concerns next time. For now, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.